listening to Turning Hard Times into Good Times with your host, Jay Taylor. If you have a question or comment about today's show, Jay would love to hear from you at 1-866-472-5790. That's 1-866-472-5790. You can also send an email to questionsfortaylor@gmail.com. That's questions, the number 4, Taylor@gmail.com. Now, back to our program.
Welcome to this special segment of Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm pleased to have with me once again Gene Epstein, who writes the Economic Beat column for Barron's and who also is involved with the book review section for Barron's as well. But more to the point of this discussion, Gene does an excellent job of heading up the New York City Junto meetings in New York City, every other month, that is. And in anticipation of the next meeting, which is going to be held this coming Thursday, I wanted to talk to Gene so he can really give us an outline of what's going on there. That event takes place at the General Society Library, 20 West 44th Street in New York City, and that's between 5th and 6th Avenues. You should show up there at around 7:30. Around 7:30, the festivities begin. It's free of charge, so if you're in the New York City area, it really is something you should follow and take. Just follow up on, because this is an excellent organization that has a lot of great guests. And I would maybe suggest to my listeners that they go to nycjunto.org, nycjunto.org, to keep up with all that's going on with Junto and other related activities in and around New York City. Gene's guest this week, this coming Thursday, is Charles Murray. So, Gene, I'm so glad you could join me again today.
Pleasure to be back with you.
Always good to have you. And Mr. Murray is definitely a very interesting fellow who's done a lot of writing. He's written a number of books. On the Junto website, in discussing this upcoming meeting with Charles Murray, the following statement is made, and I quote, "The American way of life, built on individual liberty and limited government, is on life support. Whether trying to run a business, practice a vocation, raise families, cooperate with neighbors, or follow religious beliefs, we run afoul of the government because the government decided it knows better. When we object, the government tells us, try to fight this and we'll ruin you." Murray, he shows us why we can't hope to roll back government as it is now through the normal process. So let me ask you, Gene, why is that the case? Why does he say that, and what processes does he suggest we undertake so that the American people can take back their country?
Yeah, well, this really is a bombshell from Charles Murray, of all people. He's had really an illustrious career, and I say that even though as a rock-ribbed libertarian and Austrian economist, I've occasionally blanched at some of the things he's written. But let me remind viewers who are old enough, I'm certainly old enough to have read his first widely selling book called Losing Ground that was published back in 1984. And this was at a time when it took a lot of courage to say in that book, Losing Ground, what Murray did say. He was analyzing the effects of welfare on the family and on incentives to work. And he had a stunning graph in that book in which he took the trends in the share of poverty from 1950 to 1980. And he showed that the decline in the poverty rate from 1950 to 1965 was more rapid than the decline in the poverty rate from 1965 to 1980. And, of course, the reason why we know that was key is that the first 15 years was before the government did anything about the war on poverty. The second 15-year period was when the government under LBJ began to wage war on poverty. And he tried to demonstrate, and he's been demonstrating really throughout his career via the line test, what he calls the line test, which is that progress in something or other, be it highway deaths or poverty or anything of that sort, usually is faster before the government gets involved. Usually it's slower after the government gets involved. So after that bombshell of a book, which by the way is brilliantly clear, Murray became a pariah pariah in many circles. But certainly he deserves a lot of credit. I mean, if he died tomorrow, I would certainly write in his obit. He was partly responsible for the rebellion against welfare under Clinton in the 1990s, for ending welfare as we know it. As Clinton said, Murray was really the godfather of that viewpoint. Now he's written some other books, including one of my favorites, which is a neglected small classic, which is called What It Means to Be a Libertarian, A Personal View. And I do think that even though Murray is libertarian light, in my opinion, that book is one I especially recommend to progressives. I think it's got some really brilliant nuggets in it, some really brilliant insights. I think he ought to do an update of that book. But then now to get to the big event of this coming Thursday, while most people seem to have a trajectory throughout their career where they become, maybe they start out radical, but then they end up becoming a little less so, a little bit more conservative in their views. Murray, true to form, doesn't know how to do it that way. He's gotten extremely radical with this new book, the full title of which is By the People, Rebuilding Liberty Without Permission.
Yeah.
And what does that headline? What does that subtitle mean? It means that Murray is going to take a leaf from Martin Luther King, so to speak, from the nonviolent resistance people, and he wants a massive legal revolt against the regulatory state. And that's kind of stunning. Now, many people point out that it's already happening to some degree. There is the Institute for Justice, there's the Pacific Fund. There are a number of groups that do routinely level legal challenges. Of course, we're familiar with the legal challenges on the Supreme Court level against Obamacare that failed. Murray wants to multiply this manyfold. He wants basically what he calls the Madison Fund, because his hero, his founding father hero, is James Madison, and you and I needn't quibble with that. Murray specifically says he was thinking of calling it the Jefferson Fund, but Jefferson was a little bit too libertarian for his taste. But certainly you and I would be quite prepared to live under a Madisonian state. It would be a huge step in the right direction.
For sure, Gene.
Yeah. So we needn't challenge Murray on that score, but what we want to do is applaud him for wanting to be such a rabble-rouser. He recently turned 73, and so he's definitely. He told me he's written me that he's semi-retired, but I gather he's trying to organize this. That's actually will be the other big question I'll have for him on Thursday. I heard him lecture about this at Freedom Fest, Mark Skousen's group that meets in Las Vegas every July. This was about 2 years ago in July when he was first unfurling this idea. A lot of young people in the audience. He talked about raising a fortune of money. Murray, as you may know, is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute.
Yes.
And the American Enterprise Institute, I would say, is partially libertarian. On the foreign policy side, they're neocon.
Yes.
But on the domestic side, they certainly produce a lot of good work. They are also, by far, I think they even exceed Heritage. They are extremely well funded. And Murray was saying he knows a lot of billionaires who might want to back this kind of operation.
Good.
But then I'm wondering how well he's doing with it. And that's what I'll be asking him about.
Oh, well, we certainly look forward to hearing about that and championing his cause, those of us who love liberty and are very much in agreement with his concerns about what's going on, our loss of liberty in major, major ways. I wonder if he has any ideas, any thoughts about the rise of the political outsiders, Mr. Sanders and Mr. Trump. Do you think you expect he'll have anything to say about that? Is that part of the protest, perhaps?
Well, that's not. Bear in mind, I want to, of course, remind. I don't need to remind you, but I want to remind anybody who hasn't attended Junto that Actually, in partial compromise with Vic Niederhofer, who's a philanthropist who started Junto 30 years ago. Vic, I think, thinks unduly that 100 people in a room can actually have a discussion. That's kind of impossible. It basically just means that 9 people harangue the other 91.
Yeah.
But I do feel that I want to be true to the Junto tradition and make it very interactive. And so, as you know, Jay, what I do is I separate it into intermissions. Murray, in particular, I gave him the usual choice. Do you want to make it a lecture? He is a good lecturer, I know. Or do you want to make it a one-on-one interview with me? And he said, I'll take the interview.
Good.
So I'm going to be in charge of the structure. I'm going to do 30 minutes of setting up what he wants and where he's going to go, and then leave it. Then have an intermission with interaction and dialogue from the audience. I don't say, as many do, please make sure you ask a question. I don't even say that. You want to harangue Mr. Murray, you want to tell him something, you want to ask him something, you want to argue with him, you can do so. So we go for about an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes, and about half of that is dialogue with the audience. So I want to say to anybody who wants to come that if you want to get your say in, it's not just going to be a situation where you ask a question and you have to sit down, Murray answers it. You can have a bit of dialogue with the man. So that, Jay, if you want to ask him that question, and it's certainly pertinent, you can do so, as can others. But, I think that, of course, I'm going to put a libertarian spin on it. I think that the message of Trump and the message of Bernie Sanders is a little bit garbled in transmission to some. By the way, as you and I know, you could take a few of Bernie Sanders' statements about foreign policy. You can even take a few of Donald Trump's statements about the war in Iraq and other things, and other matters, and you can say, well, gosh, he's sounding like a libertarian.
Yes.
But apart from that, you can also take many statements of Sanders and Donald Trump and realize that these guys are not at all libertarian, and they're proposing. But I like to think that the appeal of both of these candidates is that there's a certain dissatisfaction, a certain malaise going on, and my only regret, and I imagine it may be yours as well, Jay, is that we don't have Ron Paul in the race as we had. I mean, Ron Paul was articulating in the Republican nomination race a whole set of principles that I know have inspired many. And it seems absurd that Rand Paul, his son, who was equally articulate and smart, has decided that he's essentially abandoning his father's own legacy. He's sounding somewhat libertarian, but I think he would have been far more prominently get far more attention in the race had he simply picked up his father's torch. So we have Gary Johnson, I know, who was a Libertarian Party candidate in the last election, is articulating a few things, but he doesn't have the platform. So I'll interpret the interest in Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders certainly objects to crony capitalism, and that's good. He objects to some of the offenses of our foreign policy, and that's good. And I think that people are looking for an alternative, and unfortunately they're latching upon Trump and Bernie Sanders. But I'll put an optimistic spin on it and say that if they did have more of an opportunity to listen to the message of somebody like Ron Paul, then Ron Paul could rally them. But the tragedy is that Ron Paul is past 80 years old, and that his son Rand Paul is not picking up that banner. But I do think that to some degree the success of Sanders and Trump is encouraging for libertarians.
Well, it certainly is encouraging to me as a libertarian, Gene, for sure. But of course, there's a lot of anger. There's a lot of discontent. The living standards seem to be slipping for most Americans to a great extent. And to have the anger is one thing, but unless you can focus on the right solution to the problems, then it could turn into something even worse, potentially. Yeah. We hope and pray that's not the case, but that's a concern that I have, and I agree with you that Ron Paul certainly did provide, I think, the right focus. One of the things, Gene, that bothers me most, even about a lot of libertarians, certainly Rand understood this, Rand Paul understands this, is the monetary issue. That you can increase and print endless amounts of money and think that something isn't going to change for the worse, I think is something. Certainly Ron Paul talked about that. The need to have a moral money, a money that you can't have certain people having the ability to create out of thin air endless amounts of it. And then we talked to Ellen Brown and those on my radio show about the Bankruptcy Act and then the Dodd-Frank Act that really puts the average depositor in the banking system at risk. These are issues that are never even talked about, but the fact that that people don't really understand when they put their money in the bank, they're really unsecured creditors to the bank. It's no longer their money, and that they are at risk for this. And so I think there's some of these very basic issues, Gene, that nobody is talking about. Ron Paul did, and I think I agree with you 110% that we miss him. And his son, I think, wanted to talk about it, but I think he was, quite frankly, crowded out to a great extent by Donald Trump, who offered sort of an outside view of things without people understanding, what the important focus that Ron brought. Then, whoever objects to the establishment, we're for them. We want to look at them.
Yes. Well, as a matter of fact, to my left wing, my progressive friends who, with Bernie Sanders, are object to U.S. militarism, I want to point out to them to make the connection between basically the history of money. Really, you mentioned certain very important issues, but the history of money is basically about war. I mean,
yes.
The kings wanted to fight their wars. Borrowing and taxing were limited options, so they printed money. That's how they financed their wars. That's how we financed World War I, and that's how every major war has been financed. And so there's a connection there between the government's ability to print money and to wage its wars. Okay. And that's important to stress to progressives. The other way in which I will quibble with you is that I think you're letting Rand Paul off the hook a little bit too much. It seems as though he made a calculation that he wanted to sound more mainstream as a Republican Party candidate, and that it seemingly, even with the most cynical view, it was a miscalculation, and that if he simply staked out, you're perfectly right that certainly you and I have heard him. He's more than intelligent enough and more than articulate enough to be his father's standard bearer.
Sure.
But I think he decided to modify his position in order to be more acceptable to the Republican mainstream. And I would ask him, where's that gotten you? Not too far. He would have gotten much further and gotten, and maybe not won this nomination, but maybe the next or the one thereafter, had you sown the seeds of the Rand Paul revolution that your father had initially sown.
Well, I'm with you there on that, Gene. I always did feel that he wasn't quite as strong as his father. In fact, I made I said to Rand Paul when I met him one time, soon after he became a senator, I said, your legacy will be whether you can be as pure as your father. And then Mitch McConnell walked over there, and I didn't have a chance to get a follow-up, but I did tell Ron that, and Ron just laughed and said, I imagine he didn't want to hear that. So so that was an interesting dialogue that I had with both of them at the a couple of years back, as soon after Rand was elected. But in any event, Gene, I think you and I are in complete agreement, and where we want to see the country go is less government, more freedom for the individuals. There certainly are problems that we're facing now that the Founding Fathers didn't face, but nonetheless, the liberty and the need to be free, and if you want to be prosperous, for sure, they go together without a doubt. Let me ask you one thing before I let you go here. Your last article in Barron's, 3% GDP you talk about, problematic now. It doesn't look like it's going to happen this year.
Well, that's right. I'm chastened, Jay, and I'm moving in your direction. I think I will say that I think that the only way for the turmoil in China to cause a recession in the U.S. Would be for China to start dumping most of its more than $1 trillion worth of U.S. treasuries. I mean, they are a key. They are our number one foreign creditor.
Yes.
And I like the joke that it's been spun that if we ever went to war with China, we'd have to do it with money we borrow from the Chinese. So we'd have a problem there.
Yeah,
but,
we do. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't. I think that if you think of the channels in which a very bad situation in China could bring the U.S. economy to a halt, I think it would be through that credit channel. But I doubt very much that the Chinese are going to want to dump that many treasuries. Ultimately, that's a risk, but I don't think it's going to happen this time. So therefore, I do believe that the U.S. economy is not going into recession this year, even if things do worsen in China. However, certainly the performance of 2015, which was a 1.8% growth performance, the worst performance since 2012, has indicated to me that the chances of even getting to 3%, which ain't that great to begin with, are becoming more and more remote. I think the U.S. economy will probably muddle through with about 2% growth in 2016, which again is well below par. It's below the 2.8% under the George W. Bush expansion, and it's well below the 4% that was common in expansions from the 70s through the 90s. So I do blame it on the decline in the Economic Freedom Index, but that's a longer story. But I am becoming less optimistic about the ability of the economy to even eke out 3%, which isn't that good to begin with.
Well, I thank you very much, Gene. We'll have to leave it at that. I thank you very much for your opinions and also the excellent work you do at Junto, and would again encourage our listeners to, if you're living in the New York City area, attend this wonderful meeting. And Gene does a great job. He's going to be one-on-one with our guest. This
and let me stress one thing that we're looking for some things to happen. Charles Murray is proposing some action about the predatory state, and maybe he's got a good plan that we can back. And
all right.
So that's a political. It'll be a political meeting in that sense.
Very good. Well, we want the activists then, people out there that are tired, sick and tired, and aren't going to take it anymore to show up and. And get into action and do what they can to try to return our country to the people. Thanks so much, Gene, for being with us, and look to do it again in a couple of months. Thank you.